My name is Evelyn Hart, and I never imagined that the man, who once carried me on his shoulders, would one day try to strip me of everything I had built. My father, Charles Hart, used to be my hero, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who clapped the loudest at my school recitals. But that man disappeared the day my mother passed away. In his place grew someone cold, bitter, and power-hungry. When Mom died, she left behind not just her memories but also a small fortune. Our family home in Denver, a cafe she built from scratch, and her savings. But what should have united us tore us apart. My father insisted that everything belonged to him. The house, the cafe, even my mother's jewelry that she had promised to me before her final breath. At first, I tried reasoning with him. Dad, Mom's will clearly says half of everything goes to me. I reminded him gently. But he looked at me like I was a stranger. You're just a child, he snapped. Your mother was mine. Everything she owned was mine. Don't test me, Evelyn. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about grief, it was about control. My father wasn't mourning his wife, he was mourning the power she had shared. And now, he wanted it all back. Weeks later, I came home from my shift at the hospital to find the locks changed, and my belongings piled in trash bags outside. I stood there in the snow, heart pounding, as he opened the door and said coldly, "You're not welcome here anymore." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just nodded, picked up what was left of my life, and walked away. But that night, as I sat alone in my car, watching the snow fall against the windshield, I made myself a promise: one day, I'll make him regret underestimating me. Years passed. I worked, saved, and built something of my own. The pain turned into drive, the anger into fire. But when I finally received a court summons from my father, claiming I owed him everything from Mom's estate, I knew. The battle I had been waiting for had arrived. He wanted war. And I was no longer the broken girl he threw out in the snow. When I received the court notice, I almost laughed. After all these years, my father was still obsessed with control. So much so that he had dragged his own daughter into a legal war. The documents claimed that I had illegally inherited assets, and that the cafe my late mother left me was wrongfully transferred. In his mind, I didn't deserve anything, not even the memories of the woman who raised me. The court date was set for April 14th, a date I'd later realize would change everything. When I arrived at the courthouse, my heart was steady. I wasn't that naive 20-year-old girl anymore. I had grown stronger, wiser, and far more determined. As I entered the courtroom, I saw him, Charles Hart, sitting across the aisle in a tailored gray suit, his silver hair slicked back. He looked powerful, almost smug. Beside him sat his lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Gregory Vance, one of the city's most ruthless attorneys. My father didn't even glance at me, as if pretending I didn't exist would somehow erase me. My lawyer, Rachel Lawson, leaned toward me. "He's expecting you to fold," she whispered. "Men like him always do." I smiled faintly. "Then let's disappoint him." The judge entered, and the trial began. My father's lawyer painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had manipulated her mother into changing the will. He claimed I'd taken advantage of my mother's fragile state to seize control of her assets. His words were venom, designed to humiliate me, and I could see my father smirking as if he'd already won. But Rachel stood tall. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we have documentation proving otherwise. Mrs. Hart updated her will voluntarily, 2 years before her illness was diagnosed." My father's smirk faltered. A small victory, but I wasn't satisfied yet. As the hearing went on, I sat silently, letting them throw accusations. Every word, every insult, every lie. I let it sink into me, like fuel feeding a quiet fire. Because while they were focused on discrediting me, they had no idea what I had prepared. I'd spent years gathering evidence. Things my father thought no one would ever find. He'd hidden financial records, transferred money from my mother's business to his private accounts, and even filed false taxes in her name after her death. I had everything: bank statements, witness accounts, even notarized documents from Mom's former lawyer. But I wasn't going to reveal them yet. Not yet. I wanted him to feel safe. To think he was winning. To believe he still held power. Because when the moment came, when I finally spoke, it would destroy him completely. That day, as court was adjourned and I walked past him, he finally turned his head and said coldly, "You'll regret this, Evelyn. Family or not, I'll take everything from you." I met his eyes and smiled softly. "You already did, Dad. Now it's my turn." He didn't know it yet. But I had already arranged the perfect way to expose him. And when I did, it wouldn't just ruin his case. It would ruin his name. For weeks after the hearing, the courthouse hummed in my head like a machine I'd wound up and was ready to let go. I didn't sleep much. I made lists, checked dates, and rehearsed questions until the words tasted familiar on my tongue. Revenge. Real, lasting revenge, isn't a scream. It's a sequence of precise moves, timed so the other person never sees the net until they fall into it. Rachel and I retreated into a small conference room lined with case files. She spread everything out: bank ledgers, deposit slips, the notarized letter from Mom's estate attorney, and receipts from the cafe that proved income streams my father had conveniently lost when he filed his challenges. There were also things I dug up quietly. Receipts from Charles's travel to a lawyer's office in another state. Just after Mom's estate was recorded, a number of odd cash withdrawals timed to when the cafe's books showed a shortage. Rachel tapped a page. "Forgery," she said, tasting the word. "Altered signatures here, and here. The problem is, they're subtle. Expert work. Someone forged your mother's name to make transfers look authorized." "So who benefits?" I asked. "Your father," she said. "But not just him. Whoever he hired to cover the tracks benefits too." That was the moment I stopped thinking about him as Dad and started thinking about him as the man in the gray suit who'd sat and watched me get thrown out of my childhood home. The personal would be stripped away. This was evidence, law, and truth. Step 1: witnesses. I made a list of people who remembered Mom, not as a victim of infirmity, but as someone sharp and deliberate. The woman who'd rewritten a will twice to protect the cafe, who had met with her lawyer months before her illness. There was an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who'd watered Mom's garden for years, the cafe's head barista, Rawl, who kept ledgers and noticed when deposits stopped matching receipts, and Joel, Mom's old accountant, who had a soft spot for her stubbornness and still kept a stack of paper notes in his desk. We found them all. Each agreed to speak, but what I really needed was a hinge, something impossible to argue with. I had one card left that I'd been saving for weeks, a short audio file. Months earlier, before things turned bitter and before my father changed his tone, Mom had confided something to her friend, Lillian, while they sat on the cafe's back porch. It was a private recording I'd made. Not to trap anyone, but because Mom used to talk aloud while she worked through decisions and it calmed her. In one of those recordings, captured harmlessly on my phone, after she'd left a message about the upcoming will revisions, she had said in her own clear voice, "If anything happens, Evelyn gets the cafe. No question." I wired everything I could in her favor. The file was dated and backed up. Rachel had verified its metadata. It was the kind of thing a judge could hear and not unknow. We waited until the next hearing. The courtroom that day felt colder than before. Charles's camp brought new witnesses. Friends who attested to Mom's frailty. And a handwriting expert they'd hired swore the contested signatures looked genuine. The gallery murmured with anticipation. My father's smugness had returned. He'd been banking on people tiring of my story, and on his hired experts confusing the record. When my turn came, Rachel stood, moved methodically through the evidence. And then, like a conductor reaching for the final chord, she asked the judge for permission to play a piece of evidence that would be audio. The judge raised an eyebrow and granted it, more curious than cautious. The courtroom speakers hummed to life, and my mother's voice filled the room. It was simple and unadorned, the voice I knew since childhood, saying the words she'd spoken so matter-of-factly. "If anything happens, Evelyn gets the cafe. No flourish, no drama. Just the unambiguous instruction. You could feel the breath leave the room. My father, who had smirked through other testimony, paled visibly. His lawyer looked like a man trying to find his tie in a river. The judge pressed his glasses further up his nose, and looked directly at the bench where Charles sat. In that focused silence, 1,000 legal arguments collapsed into one human fact. This was my mother's voice, her intention, recorded with clear metadata proving it predated her illness and the contested documents. But the audio was only the hinge. Rachel then introduced bank records, tying transfers from the cafe to an account Charles had access to, marked with annotations in his handwriting. Joel testified to seeing strange ledger adjustments on days when Charles had been at the cafe, helping out. Rawl produced 2 deposit slips where the amounts matched, and were stamped by the same teller, who remembered Charles's large cash withdrawals from the banker's counter. Withdrawals that matched the cafe's missing revenue. It was a chain audio, ledgers, eyewitness accounts, and a digital footprint that linked Charles's lawyer to the forged documentation. Each link clicked into place like a lock being turned. My father's confidences in the hallway outside the courthouse. The whispered threats, the arrogance, meant nothing now. In the courtroom, evidence had weight. In the courtroom, truth could be loud enough to drown out a lifetime of lies. When the judge finally asked Charles to respond, the man who had once been my hero stammered, then faltered. The color had drained from his face. And as he met my gaze, the arrogance that had coated him for years slid off like old paint. I believe the court must order a forensic audit, the judge said slowly, then fixed Charles with a stare that carried the weight of precedent. And until that review is complete, this matter will be stayed. In English that meant pause, but not victory. It meant the floor beneath Charles had vanished. As we walked out of the courtroom, people watched me with a new expression. Not mockery, not applause, but something like respect. It felt odd, as if I were stepping into a story that had been waiting for me to accept the role. Outside, the cold air hit my face and cleared the fog from my mind. I didn't smile. There was still work to be done. The fuse had been lit. It was quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. People whispered about how Charles Landon, the once respected cafe owner and devoted widower, was now under investigation for forging his own late wife's signature. And while the town gossiped, I was quietly setting the final pieces of my revenge in motion. Rachel and I spent hours in her downtown office, building what she called the inheritance trap. It wasn't just about reclaiming the cafe anymore. It was about making sure my father never again had the power to destroy what Mom built. The audit unearthed everything I'd suspected, and more unauthorized wire transfers from the cafe's account into a secret fund under Charles's name, real estate assets purchased in cash, and a hidden account tied to a shell company that traced directly back to his lawyer. When Rachel showed me the final report, she smiled. Not kindly, but with the satisfaction of someone who'd just exposed a magician's entire act. He thought he could play God with the books, she said. Turns out, he's just a lousy accountant. But that wasn't enough. I wanted poetic justice. The kind that hit where it hurt most, his pride. A week before the next hearing, I drove to the cafe. My mother's cafe. For the first time in almost a year. The sign was faded, the windows dusty, but I could still smell traces of cinnamon and espresso in the air. Rawl met me at the counter, his apron still coffee-stained. Evelyn, he said softly. It's good to see you back. Everyone's been waiting for you. Those words stuck to me. Waiting for me, the girl Charles said was too emotional to handle business. The daughter, he said, was better off studying poetry than profits. Not anymore. I told Rawl to gather the staff. The same people Dad had been underpaying and intimidating since Mom's passing. That night, I stood before them and laid everything out: the forgery, the audit, the proof that Charles had stolen from the very business they helped build. For a moment, the cafe went completely silent. Then Rawl said, "So, what now?" That's when my plan took shape. We cleaned the cafe, replaced the broken light bulbs, repainted the sign. And on the day before the next hearing, I quietly reopened Luna's Haven Cafe. The name Mom had chosen under my legal ownership. I'd filed all the paperwork Rachel had prepared, transferring everything into my name once the audit confirmed my rightful inheritance. The grand reopening was simple but heartfelt. Every regular customer was invited back, and we served one free drink in Mom's memory. The news spread faster than I could have imagined. Small town reporters, local blogs, and social media pages were buzzing with the headline, "Daughter reclaims family cafe after father's forgery scandal." I didn't write that headline, but it was everything I needed. Charles, of course, saw it. That evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I knew it was him before I even picked up. His voice was sharp, laced with fury. "You had no right." "I had every right." I interrupted. "You forged Mom's name. You stole from her. You stole from me. You think you've won. That cafe was mine long before you were born." "Funny," I said, my tone icy. "Because Mom didn't think so. And neither does the court." Silence. Then the sound of his breath catching, followed by a low growl. "You'll regret this." "No, Dad," I said slowly. "You will." The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. Cameras this time. Reporters. The judge looked visibly annoyed by the commotion. Rachel handed over the audit results, each page heavy with evidence. Charles's lawyer, once smug and untouchable, now looked like a cornered rat. When the judge finished reading the summary, he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said evenly, "Mr. Landon, can you explain why over 180,000 in undocumented funds were transferred from your late wife's business account into an account under your name?" My father opened his mouth, but no sound came. The judge continued, "And why the forensic team confirmed the signatures on the will were forged, with your fingerprints on the documents." Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. For the first time, Charles looked small. Not powerful, not dignified, just caught. Rachel stood and handed over a single sealed envelope. "Your Honor," she said, "this contains an official statement from the bank's security division confirming Mr. Landon's involvement in unauthorized transactions. We request immediate restitution and ownership transfer to my client, Evelyn Landon." The judge nodded. Approved. The gavel came down like thunder. Charles sat frozen, the color drained from his face. And then, in a move I didn't expect, he turned to me, eyes full of venom and disbelief. "You set me up," he hissed. I looked right back at him, and said the same words he'd once thrown at me when he kicked me out of our home. "Business is business." His jaw clenched. His lawyer tried to calm him, but the cameras had already captured everything. The downfall, the humiliation, the poetic justice. The cafe was mine. The truth was public. And my father's reputation. Shattered. But I wasn't done yet. When the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Cameras flashed like lightning, catching every flicker of my father's rage, as the truth came crashing down around him. For a man who had spent his life controlling every narrative, every conversation, and every relationship, this was the one story he couldn't rewrite. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, watching him fall apart piece by piece. His lawyer whispered frantically, but Charles was gone. Lost in the reality that his empire had been built on lies, and I had just burned it to the ground with evidence. After court adjourned, Rachel leaned toward me and whispered, "That was poetic justice, Evelyn." But I wasn't smiling yet. Not until everything he'd done, every theft, every manipulation, was out in the open. Because my father didn't just steal money. He stole my mother's memory. He made her look like a careless businesswoman when she'd poured her soul into that cafe. I wasn't going to stop until the entire town saw who he truly was. That evening, I uploaded a video to the cafe's new social media page. The screen faded in from black. A soft piano track played in the background. "This cafe was built by my mother, Luna Landon," I said, standing in front of the newly restored storefront. "She believed in kindness, in honesty, and in the power of hard work. But after her death, Her legacy was stolen by someone who claimed to love her. Then, the video cut to scanned documents. Proof of the forgery, the bank transfers, and the court ruling. I didn't name him directly. I didn't need to. The world could connect the dots. The video went viral overnight. Thousands of shares. Comments flooded in. People wrote, "You're brave for standing up for your mom. This is the definition of karma. I used to work for your dad. He always treated us like garbage. Good for you." By morning, every local paper had run a headline. Daughter exposes father's fraud in emotional video. And then, the real avalanche began. One of my father's old business partners, apparently furious about being dragged into the scandal, leaked more documents to the press. Offshore accounts. Unreported earnings. Years of tax evasion. Rachel called me the next day, her voice half shocked, half triumphant. "Evelyn, the IRS is opening a case," she said. I nearly dropped my coffee. "You're kidding." "I'm not. You didn't just get justice. You started an investigation." For the first time in years, I laughed without bitterness. Meanwhile, my father was nowhere to be found. His lawyer had resigned, his assets were frozen, and his so-called friends had cut all ties. And yet, I didn't feel joy. Not exactly, just peace. Because I hadn't destroyed him out of spite. I'd simply let the truth breathe. A week later, I hosted a rebirth celebration at the cafe. It was packed, locals, journalists, former employees, even old friends of my mother who hadn't been back since her funeral. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air as sunlight poured through the windows. I looked around and felt something I hadn't felt since Mom was alive: belonging. Raul raised a glass and said, "To Luna's heaven," and to Evelyn, who brought it back. The room erupted in applause. I held my cup high. "To my mother," I said softly. "And to every daughter who's ever been told she can't." That moment, I swear, I felt her presence, warm, proud, and free. But later that night, as I closed up the cafe, I noticed a shadow outside. My stomach twisted. I stepped out, and there he was, Charles. Disheveled, tired. A ghost of the man he once was. He looked at me, eyes hollow, voice trembling. "Evelyn, you ruined me." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Dad. You ruined yourself. I just stopped covering for you." He shook his head, almost pleading. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything." "Yes, I do," I said quietly. "You made sure of it when you took everything from me and Mom." He took a step closer, but I didn't move. I wasn't afraid anymore. "Go home, Dad," I said finally. "If you still have one." He turned and walked away slowly, disappearing into the fog. That night, I sat in the empty cafe, staring at the old photograph of Mom hanging above the counter. Her smile seemed brighter somehow, as if she could finally rest. The storm was over. The truth was free. And for the first time in my life, so was I. But tomorrow, when I returned to that courtroom one last time, I'd deliver the final blow. One sentence that would seal his fate forever. The same sentence that would make the judge go silent, and the entire courtroom gasp. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polished wood, like other people's grudges neatly filed and waiting to be adjudicated. The gallery was packed tighter than ever. Reporters, neighbors, people who'd once applauded my father's chest beating and now whispered like a tide turning. I felt none of the trembling I'd felt the first time I'd walked these halls. Whatever fear had lived in me had been traded for a steel I didn't plan to flash until the right moment. Charles sat at the defense table, cheeks flushed, hands folded as if in prayer. He had that same set, practiced posture he'd always used when pretending to be the aggrieved party. His eyes kept flicking to me with a hunger that used to be reserved for pride. Now it looked like grief reaching for a lost foothold. Rachel gave me a sight. The look you give someone before they take a stage. I stood when she told me to stand, palms flat on the witness box, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingers. The courtroom quieted like the last exhale of a held breath. "Ms. Landon," the judge said, his tone formal. "You may continue." I had rehearsed a speech 1,000 times, the paragraphs organized like armor. But in the end, the truth I carried didn't need armor. It needed breath. I let it have one. My mother trusted the people she loved. I said plainly. She trusted my father. She wrote things down, she spoke them, she recorded them. She wanted her cafe to be a home for people who needed it. When she was gone, someone decided to rewrite that trust into something they could own. The prosecutor stood, methodical, and walked the court through Rachel's final exhibit. The ledger trail, the notarized statements, the audio file, the bank's internal memo linking transfers to Charles, the payroll records that exposed the shell company, the trail to offshore accounts. Each piece slid into place, until the whole thing looked less like fragments and more like a portrait. A portrait of theft layered with callousness. My father's face had gone paper, white in part two of the prosecutor's narrative, but I still kept my voice calm. The judge listened, inscrutable behind his glasses, the kind of face you'd expect 1,000 truths to bounce off before they left a mark. Then Rachel did something that made the murmurs stop altogether. She reached into a thin file and set a single, sealed exhibit on the bench, addressed to the court ikich itz. Iudio transkai in achina kaitan. The clerk, with a small click, placed it before the judge. Your Honor, Rachel said quietly. We would like to request admission of Exhibit Z and permission to play the accompanying recording. The recording contains a conversation directly implicating Mr. Hart and his counsel in document fabrication and deliberate misdirection of bank officials. It also contains an audio admission by Mr. Hart himself that he authorized the transfers. A hush. My father's jaw worked. He mouthed something that looked like a curse. The judge adjusted his glasses and nodded. Proceed. The audio played. There was paper rustling at first, then whispers, urgent and clinical. Two voices, one familiar and flat with control, another, a legal voice, practiced and evasive. Then my father's voice, clipped, tired, unmistakably his, saying, in a tone that had once taught me how to tie my shoes, make sure the signatures look right. We can't leave crumbs. If they discover it, spin it. They'll believe a grieving husband, not a cheat. The room breathed out at that. A collective intake that made the judge frown. The prosecuting attorney let the recording breathe and then stopped it. Everyone sat with that last line echoing, like an echo that finally found its cave. Charles turned a ghastly color. His hands tightened so hard the knuckles turned chalky. His lawyer tried to lunge to object, but the judge raised a hand sharp as a gavel. Order. The judge said, voice taut. He glanced down at the certification document. The recording had been authenticated by the bank's internal forensic unit and a third-party audio lab. He looked up like a man seeing a familiar painting rearrange itself into a forgery. He had the look of someone who'd been asked, suddenly, to reconcile two versions of a life he thought he understood. That's when, and only then, I let the rehearsed paragraphs fall away. I stepped forward, feeling the space between me and the bench as if it were a measure of time, short, inevitable, irrevocable. I looked him in the eye, not the judge, but my father, and I said, clear and measured, the one word I had saved like a sealed stamp ready to press. Perjury. It was small. It was a single syllable, but it landed like the last key in a lock. The judge's eyes widened, a faint line ran across his forehead, like someone realizing a map had been changed under his feet. He paled, not from guilt, but from the sudden weight of what that word meant in that room, criminal contempt, the collapse of credibility, the beginning of a chain that could reach beyond one man. Perjury is a word that eats reputations alive. It forces machines of justice to cough and re-evaluate. When I said it, the murmurs swelled, and then stopped as if the court itself was listening, waiting for the world to decide whether it would stand for the thing my father had done. Ms. Landon. The judge said slowly, voice tight now with unexpected strain. On what basis do you claim perjury? Rachel handed him the certified transcript of the recording, the bank's internal audit, and the newly subpoenaed phone logs connecting calls between Charles and his counsel on the exact dates of the forged entries. The documentation rolled out like dominoes. Metadata, timestamps, matchings that no defense could plausibly explain away. The judge read, and as he read, his face did something I had only ever seen happen to men like my father. When the world they depended upon was stripped out from under them, he looked smaller. He paled further, and for a heartbeat, I thought I could see the judge's own conscience flicker, as if the gravity of the word I'd spoken had been contagious, sweeping in the cold air of accountability. Given the material presented, and the appearance of deliberate falsification and witness tampering, he said, his voice a shade hollower than before, "This court will order an immediate referral to the district attorney for criminal perjury charges, and place Mr. Hart under temporary protective custody, pending further investigation." Charles' shoulders slumped. His lawyer's face was a study in fury and impotence. Reporters scribbled, jaws dropped. Outside, cameras flashed as if heralding the end of a chapter. When the bailiff took him in custody, he turned to me. His eyes were feral for a moment. Not the hunting glare of a man about to win, but the version of my father who'd learned too late the cost of predation. "You'll be sorry," he hissed. I felt the old ache, the one that had lived in my bones since he'd first changed the locks on our home. But I had practiced patience for so long that whatever emotion rose in me now was not vengeance. It was something quieter and cleaner closure. After the gavel, the courthouse emptied like a chest being breathed out. People pressed their palms together and said things to me I'd never heard. Apologies, condolences, congratulations. Neighbors who'd sat with my father at funeral dinners came forward to admit they had suspected, and were sorry they hadn't said anything sooner. Raul hugged me hard enough that I felt the warmth go to my core. Nora called me from somewhere in the city, voice raw. "Mom," she said, "I'm coming home." Legal battles don't end with a single word. We still had trials and subpoenas and the slow, legal unspooling that takes time. The district attorney would build a case, evidence would be tested. But the moment the judge's face changed because of a single word, perjury, was the hinge on which everything swung. In the months that followed, the charges expanded: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and perjury. Charles pled guilty to several counts when the weight of evidence became too heavy. The cafe remained in my care. I restored it inch by inch, honoring my mother's quiet insistence that it be a place of warmth and second chances. I didn't celebrate his disgrace in a way that satisfied the petty part of me. Instead, I planted a small herb garden outside the cafe, where customers could pick sprigs of mint and rosemary. People gathered there, and we talked about life, about mistakes, about the slow work of making amends where amends could be made. A year later, at the cafe's anniversary, Nora stood beside me, stronger, laughing with regulars who had once taken for granted the warmth my mother gave them. When the mayor gave a speech about community and integrity, he used the word restored. And it felt right. I kept the judge's final look in my memory. The moment a single word shifted the axis of power in a room full of history. It was the kind of justice that didn't roar. It simply rearranged the light. If anyone ever asked me what I had wanted most during those long years of cold dismissal and legal battles, I would say this: not to humiliate, not to ruin, but to see truth look someone in the face, and no longer be tolerated. Perjury was the word that did it. And for the first time in my life, I said my name and it didn't tremble.